It's time now for perspective, and we're heading to China. First it was the one-child policy, then the two-child policy, and now it's the three-child policy. This week, Chinese authorities announced that couples are now permitted to have up to 3 children, a huge policy shift prompted by data that revealed a dramatic decline in the birth rate of the world's most populous country. China's fertility rate currently stands at 1.3, well below what's needed to maintain a stable population size. Well, to discuss China's fertility crisis and the government's proposed remedy, I'm joined now by Gietel-Basten, Professor of Social Science and Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on France 24 today. Let's start by talking about the problem at hand. There was an 18% drop in the number of babies born in China in 2020 compared to the previous year. Why is that?
Well, COVID. I think there's a simple answer. It's the same as in France or in America or in many other places around the world. 2020 was a very tough time for everybody, not only because of the impact of the public health impact, but the economic fallout and the issues of uncertainty. So I think it's not quite right. China definitely has a low fertility rate, that's for sure. But taking 2020 as a baseline for comparison to other years doesn't really make a lot of sense, because 2020 and 21 will have lower fertility rates than previously, and we would expect some kind of bounce back in later 2021 and 2022.
Nonetheless, the government in Beijing is sufficiently alarmed to make quite an important policy U-turn here. What is the rationale behind this latest decision from Beijing, do you think?
Well, so-called optimizing the fertility policy was always on the cards. This was in the 14th five-year plan, which we're already in the middle of now. And this is really just kind of one small part of the government's strategy to respond to a rapidly aging population and to slow population growth. And other aspects include kind of investing in childcare and kindergartens and trying to lower the cost of childbearing and education, but then also to kind of improve human capital overall, so in terms of investment in education and investment in healthcare. But I think really but you are right. I mean, like this 1.3 number was a bit of a shock, and the low fertility and the nature and the scale of aging, which came out in the census earlier in May, really kind of pushed this issue to the top of the agenda, which is why this relaxation came through. Because it does seem a little bit inconsistent, right? That if you're very worried on the one hand about very low fertility and all of its consequences, why would you have birth control policies at the same time? So I think it's just the latest step in kind of fixing that slight inconsistency.
But it does, of course, raise the question, why simply not do away with this family planning policy altogether?
Yeah, I think there's really two main reasons why this is the case. I think the first one is, first, you've got to remember that there's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of officials working around the country in the family planning apparatus. And, their jobs and their orientation and their work needs to change at the same time as any policy. And so in the past, we've seen actually many of these officials have been made redundant. They've lost their jobs. They've had their incomes cut. So and also, of course, the work they have to do will have to change. And so that requires some kind of time and some tact. A second issue as well really is relating to the nature of Chinese policy making. If you're in France, for example, as soon as a government comes in, the first thing it would like to do is look at the previous government's policies and maybe scrap them and get rid of them. It's a statement upon the past. Well, in this, you could think that China is almost the opposite of that. When you've had a one party running the country for 70 years or so, then any kind of scrapping or statement on a previous policy is also a kind of implicit statement on the people that brought in that policy before. And of course, they're all part of the same party. So any change in policy in China is not a scrapping. So that's why we shouldn't say it's a scrapping of a policy. It's really more just the changing or the evolution of a policy, which can be traced back to the 1980s, even the 1970s.
And just how chaotic is this demographics crisis in China? I mean, of course, if we think about it, the one-child policy was in place for some 35 years. A lot of people in China of child-bearing age were the product of that policy. They're looking after parents as only children. Are they really likely to want 3 children when it's just them looking after their parents already?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions in there, right? I think that the issue about the appetite for a third child is a very important one. And the survey data that we have suggests that the ideation for a third child is indeed low. And that is in common with elsewhere in the region. So here in Hong Kong, where we've had no history of birth control policies, but also whether it's in South Korea or in Japan or in Singapore or elsewhere. And you're absolutely right. One of the reasons is there's other responsibilities of care, particularly for parents and for parents-in-law. So we have something which is called the 4-2-1 dilemma, in the sense that you've got 2 people in the middle looking after 2 sets of parents and a child. So then the idea of adding 1, let alone 2, to that is that's very tough. And then, but it's not just about care. It's about the direct costs of having children. It's about getting started in life, the difficulty in terms of costs of housing. The very, very strong. I mean, one of the big differences between our part of the world and France, for example, is in terms of gender roles, and particularly domestic gender roles, that there is the burden of care very, very, very strongly falls on the shoulders of women, which therefore translates into very severe penalties in terms of wages and career progression. So there's really a whole package of different reasons why we would expect fertility to stay pretty low in China and elsewhere in our region.
And of course, it's interesting to remember that, of course, this sort of family planning policy has a direct impact on the way women's bodies are policed. How much of a change do you think this policy shift will have on women's bodily autonomy, women who fall pregnant, who may not necessarily in the past have been able to have that child within the confines of the law?
Well, that's exactly. I think this is a very important point, and it's, just because this is not going to make a major difference to the overall size and structure of Chinese demographics, that doesn't mean to say that it's not important, and that for many thousands. So even if it's only 1% of women who would like to have a third child, in China, there's still a lot of people, right? And that would still account for maybe 5, 6, 7 million women of childbearing age. And so for people who wish to have a third child, of course, this makes a big difference. And that also perhaps takes us to another reason as to why these changes have been brought in. I mean, over time, there have been certain kinds of it's been pretty clear that not only is the policy inconsistent in terms of kind of demographic goals of being worried about low fertility, but then controlling by having in birth restrictions. There's also been, some cases of how this is enforced at the local level, particularly in terms of the social maintenance fees, which are charged if couples have a child outside of quota. And again, it just becomes very difficult to keep imposing these social maintenance fees on the one hand, with this message of, well, we need more babies, right? We need to have this increase in fertility. And of course, even if they do have more babies, it's not going to fix the problems that China has. Many of the challenges that China has at the moment with relation to pensions, for example. But again, it is a step. It is part of the plan. It's and it's moving in that direction.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for right now, but Gietel-Basten, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. Gietel-Basten, Professor of Social Science and Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Thank you. A reminder now of our top stories today. At least 2 pro-democracy activists are arrested in Hong Kong as yet another vigil in memory of the victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre is banned in the territory. And ramping up pressure on Mali's military leaders to restore civilian rule, France announces it's suspending all joint military operations with the Malian army until further notice.